We've spoken about cyber asset attack service management technology on this channel before, but we really haven't gone into the fact that it's part of a larger family of cybersecurity tools known as attack surface management technologies. Now, Gartner has adopted the National Institute of Standards and Technology's definition of an attack surface, that being the set of points on the boundary of a system element or an environment where an attacker can try to enter, cause an effect on, or extract data from that system element or environment. So now I'm sitting here with NewPush Chief Technology Officer Balázs. Can you explain what attack surface management technology is and all of the parts that it comprises of?
Yeah, it's nice to be here again with you, Jeremy. Certainly, these new technologies are hard to describe. And actually, we feel very good about working with Gartner, whose analysts have worked tirelessly to try to categorize these because it's hard and this space is evolving very fast. And difficult for CISOs and CIOs to keep track what to focus on. So we've been, as you said, focusing on cyber asset attack surface management in the past. So Gartner's dropping the word cyber often. And so we're going to focus on some of the attack surface management tools, and that allows an enterprise to really understand their exposure. In the past, we've been focusing on vulnerability assessment, vulnerability remediation, and that's a big part of it. But today, I touch on the exposure management, attack surface assessment, and attack surface management.
Okay, so let's start with the first term in that, exposure management. What is that?
So exposure management actually wants to take into account attack surface, also vulnerability and validation. On attack surface, we will be touching on internal, external, and the digital risk. On vulnerability, it's a better known quantity. We're looking at prioritization, classification, and awareness. And then on the validation side, there is targeted, comprehensive, and compliance. And we tend to focus on compliance the most, but the validation is also a very important piece to look at in a holistic manner. And when we put all these together, then we basically have exposure management.
All right, so let's dig a little bit further into attack surface. How does that work?
Attack surface is maybe the most exciting aspect for most people. And Gartner splits it into three categories, which I think is the right approach. You can go to Forrester or IDC, they'll have similar approaches. But I really like the clarity that Gartner defines it. So we're looking today beyond cyber asset attack surface management, which we already talked about. So today we'll focus a little bit about external attack surface management. So that's the external exposure of the enterprise. And then the third component that's part of attack surface management is the digital risk. They call it digital risk protection services, really. The NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they really go deep into these standards. And especially you have the NIST 853 and then the NIST 800-171, which are notable definite standards that in cybersecurity we need to be aware of. What you may then ask, okay, what all this is good for? And basically, each pillar that I mentioned needs to be able to answer to one of the key questions that you have. One question that you want to ask is, what does my enterprise look like from an attacker's perspective? What does my exposure look like from their perspective? And they are typically from the outside, so it's the external exposure. And then very often we have technologies like BitSight and Security Score that can actually look at this external exposure and allow us to have a good idea. Now, attackers tend to be more intrusive in the way they are actually looking at the enterprise than companies like BitSight, but it gives you a really good idea. And frankly, if BitSight shows something and they catch something before you actually know it, then you need to review what can be improved in your processes to catch it before BitSight. So that's really something that often comes up. The other aspect, the second pillar, is what software is present in my organization that may potentially cause an attack surface, because that's the other vector of attack. So applications that are run and that can be interacted with, and attackers can leverage those applications. So we all heard of people sending PDFs with a payload, malware payload, and things like that. So that's the second pillar. And finally, one of the things that you also want to understand, and that's the third pillar, is what would happen to my company if an attacker were to launch a campaign against me? What is my risk exposure there? That deals with the risk. So that's really the three, the internal, external, and the digital risk. That's the three main components that you're looking at in terms of the attack surface.
You mentioned attack surface assessment tools. What categories would you say they fall into?
The attack surface assessment tools fall into two major categories. I tend to split them into detective and preventive controls. Gartner talks about visibility and prioritization. So visibility is basically understand what assets you have in scope. And the prioritization is the ability to have a risk score. That's what we do with our executive dashboard, so that for the first time, you can bring the risk from operational data all the way up to the executive chain, which allows executive now to include in their strategic decisions the cyber risk or the infrastructure risk, which typically is pushed down. It says, oh, okay, my CIO is dealing with the cyber risk, or my CISO is dealing with that. I, as a CEO, don't need to worry about it. But really, as a CEO, I can make better decisions if that risk is actually included in those key performance indicators that I'm looking at when I define the strategy of a company, because that's what I usually do. I balance the risk versus the benefit of certain strategies. And that way I can have a more complete picture. So that's, again, the visibility is more on the operational level, and the prioritization, that's a reflection of risk. But prioritization goes all the way down to the operational levels as well, because now once I define the strategy at the board level, at the CEO level, that I want that strategy priority to be trickled down all the way to operational decisions, where we also tend to have a disconnect, where in the field, people tend to override the strategy because there's no clear connection between the strategy defined by the CEO and the priorities that I can detect at the operational level. And this is where basically with a good ASA tool, or I would say a good ASA toolkit, you can actually ensure that from the strategy, you go down all the way to the tactical, and the tactical will match with the strategy, as opposed to inadvertently, even at the CIO level and lower, the CEO strategy may be overridden, not because people are rebelling against the CEO, just simply there is a disconnect in the tools. The risk tools, the risk scoring tools that the CEO gets tend to not be in direct connection with the tools that operational folks and security folks are using. And that's where you can really improve by having the right ASA capabilities deployed in the enterprise.
And I think this also goes to show that when you look at the top executives in many companies and organizations nowadays, cybersecurity needs to be prioritized, and they all have to be on the same page in regards to that, because a cyber attack is one of the most dangerous things that could happen to an organization. And just now we have came up with the idea that everybody has to be on the same page. The CEO needs to correct information, as does the CISO, and so on.